Okay, so welcome. Let's start. Are there any questions? Okay, so what I would like to do today in the first part of the lecture, I would like to talk about to continue what I started last week and talk about, in particular, carbon taxes, and I would like to discuss a paper about Sweden. Okay, how the effects of carbon taxes have been estimated in the case of Sweden. Okay. So here, this is just a picture. Again, this is a shortcut for those of you who have the computer. Okay, they can click the link, and it leads to the data, some data on carbon taxes. This is just to give you again an idea about what carbon taxes look like. Well, there are different types according to different types of, because this is mainly on fuels, different types of fuels, and well, what you can see is there is a great heterogeneity. Okay, and in particular, what I would like to show you that, well, you can't see it really. Okay, those graphs are pretty. This is Sweden here. Okay, so Sweden has very large taxes and also started very early, okay, as I'm going to discuss right now. Okay. Okay, so let's discuss again a recent research paper that addresses the issue of the impact of carbon taxes on CO2 emissions. Okay, so again, the question is like the one we have seen last week. Okay, last week I discussed a paper about the impact of an emission trading system on CO2 emissions. Okay, reduction on CO2 emissions. And here, as promised last week, I'll discuss now the case of carbon taxes, on the effect of carbon taxes on CO2 emissions. And this case is about Sweden, because Sweden was started very early compared to other countries, and that's why they used it as a, I'm going to discuss now, as a quasi experimental study. Okay. So again, the idea is the following. Okay, so what the author here tries to do is create like an experimental study again. Okay, so you have a treated group and a control group. The treated group in this case is the one where you have taxes, okay, carbon taxes, and what you would like to do is you would like to compare the outcome, in terms of performance. In particular, here what we're interested in is CO2 emissions, reduction in CO2 emissions, by comparing the treated group with the non-treated group. Okay, this is the idea here. Okay, so as I mentioned, okay, this is Sweden is again an ideal case because it started very early in the 90s, and also mainly in the transport sector. Okay, I'm going to discuss to give you some details here. The problem is so this is a general overview. Okay, and then I'm going into a little bit of the details. Okay, so then if you are interested in all the nuances, okay, again, I invite you to read the paper. I'm going here just to give you a flavor, okay, of what's done in the paper, the result, okay, and how to carry out research. Okay, so here the problem is like the one we have seen last week. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to construct a counterfactor, because in economics we don't have counterfactors. So if you do something, you will never know what happens if you what would have happened if you had not done so. Okay, so that's why you have again to construct a counterfactual, and what here the author does is the counterfactor is constructed from a comparable group of OECD countries. Okay, and again, this group is constructed in such a way to minimize the distance over a certain period. Okay, similar to what we have seen last week. Okay. Now these are the main results. Okay, so again, I promise I'm going a little bit into the details. Okay, but just to give you an overview. Okay, so here the counterfactual is constructed again. What the authors call synthetic Sweden is constructed, and then they compare what happened to Sweden compared to this artificial counterfactual. Okay, so it's not a real counterfactual; it's a constructed one, an artificial one. Okay? And what the authors found is these two main results. Okay, so CO2 emissions in Sweden declined almost 11% compared with the control group. So quite a strong impact. And even more, perhaps interesting, if you want, is the fact that the carbon tax elasticity is much larger than the price elasticity. Okay, because this is quite important, because what policymakers usually do is they use the price elasticity to estimate impact of carbon taxes. Okay, and what the authors show is that this is not true. This is not true. This is quite a general finding. There are many other papers that show the same. That the tax elasticity, in this case, in particular, the carbon tax elasticity is much larger than the price elasticity. This is kind of a behavioral, okay, so meaning that taxation has a much stronger impact than a price change, okay, kind of a behavioral response. Okay. In this case, the carbon tax elasticity is 3 times larger. It's larger than the price elasticity, so much larger. So if you would use, in this case, the price elasticity, okay, for policy evaluations, you would largely underestimate the two effects. Okay, so by using the price elasticity, which is commonly used because they are more easily available, okay, price elasticity rather than specific tax elasticities, okay, then you would largely underestimate the two effects. Okay, so these are the main results. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit. Give you a little bit more of details, okay, of how this is. I did not ask, but at home, everything fine? Can you hear me? I forgot to ask, but everything okay at home?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry for not asking. Okay, so here, a little bit of background, okay, so a little bit into the details of the paper, okay. So the carbon tax, as mentioned before, was introduced in 1991, and it was $30 per CO2, and successively increased, and nowadays it is $132. Okay. And it mainly affects the transport sector. So this would be 90% of revenues from consumption of gasoline and motor diesel. Okay, so large. And why is it the case that it mainly affects the transport sector? Because large sectors, especially the industry and agriculture, they received considerably lower tax rate. And here the worry was that strong taxes on these industries, okay, would somehow burden the industry and therefore lead to carbon leakage, okay, and reduce the competitiveness of these industries. Okay, that's why it was they received a much lower tax rate. And in a similar way, the fuel used for electricity production was completely exempted. Okay. So electricity was completely exempt. So that's why And also domestic aviation was excluded. So that's why the only part that's fully covered is the transport. But the authors claim, okay, still it's quite interesting case to study because it's the largest source of CO2 emissions from 1990 to 2012. Over this time period, it was the largest source of CO2 emissions. And it's close to 40% of total CO2 emissions per year. Okay. That's why it's in addition to this, there is another tax, the value-added tax, okay, that started of 25%. It started in 99 on gasoline and diesel. So you have two taxes, okay, the value-added and the carbon tax mentioned before. But there are two taxes. This is quite common. Okay, so you have two tax rates. Okay, so in Italy you have it as well. It's quite common to have value-added and the carbon tax. Okay, so now let's talk about the methodology. Okay, so a little bit into the details of what's done in the paper. So just to give you an idea, again, this is the method is known as the synthetic control method, and the idea is to construct. Okay, so what the authors here try to do is they try to construct. Let me perhaps. Sorry for this. Okay. So what the authors try to do is they construct they construct a counterfactor, what they call a synthetic Sweden. Okay, how do they do this? Again, they take OECD counts. Now you see the difference compared with what's done in the paper I discussed last week. Here, it's country-wide. Okay, it's not industry or it's not in installation. Here it's really country. Okay, and what therefore the authors here did is try to create this synthetic group by taking OECD countries and but in a weighted way. Okay, again, so putting weights at different countries such that again the distance between Sweden before the treatment, okay, is lowest. Okay. Clearly, you want to take countries where such policies were not in place. Okay, countries where such policies were not in place. Okay, because otherwise you would not have the treated effect. Okay. Because remember the idea of what I mentioned last week. Okay, so what you would like to have is you would like to have a control group that is not treated, and then you would like to have a treatment group. Okay, here in this case you have just one country that is treated, right, that is Sweden. You would like to compare its performance with a control group that is not treated. Okay, so therefore what you would like to have is that these two groups, well in this case it's a group and a country, but the two, okay, let's call the former one is the synthetic, what the authors call the synthetic Sweden. You would like the synthetic Sweden to be as similar as possible as Sweden, okay, before the treatment, and then treat Sweden and just compare the outcome. Okay, that's what the authors here. And therefore, what here is done, okay, you take data from 1960, because clearly the treatment occurred in 1990, but you want to match, okay, you want to create synthetic Sweden by looking at data previous to the treatment. Okay? That's why you need a longer time span. Okay? And they took 14 OECD countries, data from the World Bank, and what you do is, yeah, okay, you remember only in 2005 That's why the time period they look at is till 2005, because then in 2005 the EU emission trading system started, and therefore countries, at least EU countries, had very similar policy implemented. That's why they look only at data till 2005. So therefore, from 1990 till 2005, and again, what they do is, as I explained before, okay, they want to minimize the distance between Sweden and this control group. Okay, so this is the way they create this synthetic Sweden in the pre-treatment period. Okay, so before 1990. Okay. Is it clear the idea, okay, of how to construct that? Because then, if you just let time roll, okay, and compare then the treated with the non-treated, you have created a counterfactual which doesn't exist in reality, okay, but kind of a counterfactual, and you can compare outcomes. Okay. So results, if there are questions, let me know. Okay, again, if you really want to know technicalities, okay, look up the paper. Just want to give you the flavor of what's done, okay, just to give you an idea. Okay, so what are the results? Okay, so as I already mentioned, okay, the combined effect of carbon tax and a value-added tax over 1990 and 2005. The estimated reduction is 10.9% from the transport sector in an average year. Okay, here these are the data. Okay, so just to again, so you have a representation of what's done. Okay, and again, this gives me the opportunity, okay, to explain, okay, how this is done. Okay, so remember, the dashed line here is the synthetic Sweden. I hope you can see the picture. Okay, so the dashed line is the synthetic Sweden, and you see what you would like to do is you would like to choose. Well, first of all, you have to choose countries that have not policies like Sweden in place, previous pre-treatment, okay? And then what you would like to do is, so given these countries, you would like to choose weights such that the dashed line is as close as possible to the continuous line. Not only here, this is for emissions, but also for other indexes, okay? Again, if you want to look at the paper, okay, for details, okay. And then you see the treatment is in 1990, because in 1990 you have the value-added tax and the carbon tax, and then you see, you just compare your synthetic Sweden, which is the dashed line, with the continuous line, which is the actual Sweden. Okay, so the policy in place, and the difference, intuitively, the difference should be due to the policy in place in Sweden. Okay, and you see here that you have quite a strong reduction in CO2 emissions. Okay, these are per capita CO2 emissions. Everything clear? Yes?
Matter of which weights the data collection uses to manipulate the results?
Yes, sure. Yes, what you have to do is what the authors did. Okay, is, well, first of all, they've chosen countries that had not not such a policy in place, and then they chose the weights, because it's not just averaging this, but placing the weights in such a way that the distance between the dashed line and the continuous line is minimized. Okay?
It can be manipulated, right?
Everything can be manipulated. Yeah, we hope. I mean, this is published in American Economic Review journal, which is a top journal. So, but we know that if you look at if you look at papers published in top scientific journals for medicine, you know that many are just false. Okay, so here it's believe it or not. Okay, so if you do not believe it, by the way, I think the authors have made, I don't know if it's for this paper or for the other paper, but the data should be available on the Harvard website. So if you don't believe in the authors and you don't believe American Economic Association, okay, just do your math on your own. Okay? That's the only thing I can. So at a certain point in time, you have either to believe or not believe. If you do not believe, if you're a non-believer, which is okay, you have to do the math on your own. I'm here just explaining what's done. Okay. Then you're correct. Okay, you can. Everything can be manipulated. That's just drop one count, you add another count, and you might get a different result. Any other question? Okay, here again, you see Sweden versus synthetic Sweden. Here you see the gap. Okay, this is the gap. So again, this is the first part. So remember, the first part is by construction like this. Okay, so you want the gap to be as small as possible, and then starting the treatment, okay, you have that the gap opens, and this is because of the treatment. Okay. Now, this is the first result. Okay. Now, second result. Okay, the second result is about disentangling the carbon tax and the value-added tax. Okay. And what they would like to do is then estimate the price and the tax elasticity for gasoline. Okay. And what they do again, data take Sweden, the price and consumption of gasoline over 1970 till 2011. And here I'm not going into any technical details, okay, because it's not particularly interesting, but if you, for those of you are interested, you can look at the paper. I'm going to give you the result. Okay, yeah. The result is the carbon tax elasticity is 3 times larger than the price elasticity. This is, as I mentioned before, this is well documented, so that the tax elasticity is much larger than the price elasticity is in keeping with other findings documented in the literature. And it's because of a behavioral response. Okay, so consumers seem to respond much larger to a tax increase rather than to a price increase. Here you see in particular, what the authors found is the carbon tax alone led to a 6.3% reduction in CO2 emissions in an average year, while previous results found small or no effect on CO2 emissions. Because of clearly here of a different methodology. Then again, you can either believe or not believe, okay, in the data, and it's you should always be critical, okay. That's very okay, because as I mentioned before, many studies, okay, it's well documented, okay. Many studies have problems with data, okay, because you see, usually papers go, undergo double blind review, okay. So meaning that I, as an author, do not know who's going to review my paper, and the referees, okay, often do not know who is writing. Often, okay, do not know who's writing the paper, okay, and therefore they should go over the data of the result. But again, here the problem, and it's a problem I'm not so sure about economics, but it's a particular problem about approval of drugs, okay, medicine, because there the problem is that the referees do not have access to the data. Okay, that's a problem in medicine. Okay. So they just get the results, but they do not get, because they are usually, I mean, they're very valuable. Okay, they're protected by the company. Okay, and therefore often the problem there is that they get just the results, but they do not have access to the raw data. While in economics, often, most of the time, journals require full disclosure of data. Okay, and but while there is a whole, I mean, there is a whole literature on cheating in academics. Okay, so for those of you who are interested, there's a whole literature. Okay. Also, there are now, I mean, there are now, it's very interesting. Okay, for those of you interested, there are also computer programs that write scientific articles, and some of these scientific articles have been published. Okay, by inventing data and doing some regressions. Okay, now you can do this with artificial intelligence. It's quite easy to do this, and some of these articles got published in good journals. That clearly, I mean, I guess it's not the case of this paper, okay, yeah, but you never know. Okay, there are some famous cases also in economics where some over the past years, in particular. Well, I don't want to go into the discussion too much, but where there have been made major mistakes in spreadsheets, in particular, okay, getting wrong results, okay, that then had a very strong impact on also economic policy, okay, in particular, here referring on case of public debt, okay, the effect of public debt on growth and so on and so forth. There are some very famous cases of, I don't know if it's scientific misconduct or if it's just some random errors that have been made by research assistants or whoever. Okay, you never know if it's really misconduct or cheating or if it's just random errors. You never know. Here, this is, but again, I don't want to spend clearly an interesting topic, but not the topic here I would like to spend too much time on. This is just the final picture here I would like to display. Okay, here you see the three. Okay, most likely you can't see, but the dashed line is the counterfactual, and then you have the no carbon tax but value added, which is the dashed dotted line here, like this one here, and then you have the continuous line, which is Sweden, that is the value added and the carbon tax. Okay, so this is how they disentangle the three. Okay, is it clear? Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay, so if there are no questions, no comments. Okay, I would like to start. Okay, with. I would like to start now with international trade and environment. Okay, so here, what I would like to discuss in particular are the following specific things. I would like to talk about carbon leakage. This is again a big topic as you have seen. Well, when I discussed Sweden, for instance, I also discussed that last week. Okay, so policymaker when implementing environmental policies are really worried about consequences for their industries and not only for the environment. Because if you have a policy, because remember the problem is that CO2 emissions and the impact on climate change is a global problem, not a local problem. Okay? So what we would like to do is we would like to reduce CO2 emissions globally, not just locally. Okay? So if we tax our industries, but they just move, production just moves abroad, okay, then, and you have 100% leakage, meaning that a 1% reduction here at home leads to a 1% increase abroad. Okay, so meaning that at the global level nothing changes, then this is something clearly that we would not like to have. Okay, because in this way, what you would do is you would just punish in some way your firms, okay, by increasing their production costs, but without changing what you're really worried about is overall CO2 emissions. Okay? And that's called carbon leakage. Okay? So the first part that I would like to do is I would like to therefore discuss a very simple model of international trade, which is the Geraldine trade theory. Okay, those of you who have taken economics and as an undergraduate, in undergraduate studies, most likely are already familiar with theorems. Okay, so I hope, nevertheless, to not be too boring. Okay, explain perhaps things from a slightly different point of view. Okay, this can be explained. And this also gives me the opportunity to introduce some basic microeconomic stuff, which is useful later on, and which is useful perhaps for those of you who have not taken microeconomics. Yeah. So therefore, here the main focus here will be on carbon leakage. It's all built up to carbon leakage, and then on carbon leakage, I will have again a discussion from an empirical point of view. Okay, so first of all, I will explain how carbon leakage comes about, and then I will show you data on this. So how this has been estimated, and I'll discuss some policies. So what has been done in order to avoid carbon leakage, and what, for instance, the EU is implementing in order to avoid carbon leakage in the future. And I also discuss some policies that have been implemented. In particular, I'll briefly mention the case of California, which has interesting policy in place, and show you some results on it. Okay? So this is the first part. In the second part, I'll talk about, again, related to the first, it will be on, again, trade, growth, and policy in the environment. And in particular, here I will study, well, I will talk about environmental goodness curve. And I guess since this is a very discussed topic, I guess you're already familiar with it. I will not go into the details of the environmental goodness. It's so popular that I think you will, perhaps also in econometrics, you see some, I mean, how it can be studied. Okay, and there the literature is very controversial because by changing the sample size, by changing countries, by changing the pollutant, you get different results. Okay? Also by changing the estimation method. Okay, so really, again, that's why you should really worry about how things are done. Okay? So do things correctly. You should be very critical. Okay? About how things are done, just changing methodology, changing sample size, countries, get different results. And then what I would like to discuss more length, greater length, is trade liberalization, economic policy, and environment. Here I will show you why in the first part I introduce and discuss everything, everything from a graphical point of view, so I don't just use graphs. Just very few formulas. Here I'll be a bit more detailed from a mathematical point of view. I'm showing you a formal one. Okay, how to analyze welfare. Because here I would like to study welfare, the change in welfare, if there is a change in trade policy. Okay.
I just have to ask you if you can take your
okay, you can, because you have to hear me. Okay, yes. Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't see that. Yeah, that's the pro. You can't. Okay. Yes. Okay, sorry. I'll try to remain here. Okay. Okay, I was just talking about what we're going to see in this in these lectures. Okay, so in the second part of the lecture, of these lectures, we'll see the effect of trade liberalization on social welfare. And so from a formal point of view, and then what we will see also again from an empirical point of view. Okay, so what are the effects of trade liberalization on in terms of empirical results? Okay, so again, try to combine here again theory and empirical results. Okay, and I'm discuss in the second part here several papers. Okay. With different methodology and different, try to obtain different results. Okay, and then if given time, we see, okay, whether or not to discuss also ecological dumping. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so here, what are the problems addressed? The problems addressed are environmental resources and international trade. And here, what's going to be key is that environmental resources depend on regulation. Okay, so meaning that environmental resources are endogenously determined. Okay, they depend on policy. And therefore, what we study is how environmental regulation affects trade and welfare. So here key is environmental resources are endogenous, they depend on policy, and therefore how to choose also, so the problem would be how to choose environmental policy, and therefore what are the consequences in terms of trade and welfare. That's why you see here how to choose policy becomes very important, because you could choose policy in a strategic way. Okay, so as already mentioned, okay, here, therefore, I will review traditional trade theory, a very basic one, and then study extension to incorporate environmental resources. And therefore, what we'll see is we'll study what is the comparative advantage in production of environmentally intensive commodities, okay? So because trade theory is really about comparative advantage, and therefore studying the extension to environmental resources, we are interested in how you can have, what are the conditions such that you have a comparative advantage in environmentally intensive commodities. So also, what are environmentally intensive commodities, and therefore how you can have a comparative advantage. And then here I will see a general equilibrium model of trade and study effects of trade liberalization on welfare. As I've already kind of mentioned in the introduction, what you have is we're going to study in particular two results here. One is the gains from trade that comes from trade liberalization, and the other is the impact on the environment. Okay, these are the two things that we are going to study in detail. And then, if there is some time left, I'll also study manipulation of environmental standards in a strategic way, okay, in order to benefit the national producers. And that can lead to ecological dumping. Okay, this is the outline. Okay, so now let's go. Are there any questions before starting? Any curiosities? Or okay. Okay, so here, well, the common, okay, let's say the consensus, main consensus here is that trade enlarges consumption possibilities and as a consequence, welfare. Okay, this is the main consensus here. Okay, so that's why trade liberalization should really increase welfare. Okay, because it enlarges consumption possibilities. Well, now we are living in a troubled world, okay, right now, and over the past years, and we have seen that, well, trade on the one side enlarges consumption possibilities and such welfare, but on the other side, it increases dependence of one country on other countries. Okay, and that's what we experience. I mean, nowadays it's quite clear, but it was already quite clear over the past years. Okay, so the pandemic has already shown this in a very important way. Okay, so what happens if there are severe economic shocks in one country, this could strongly affect other countries because now they depend on their production. Okay, so you have a strong, clearly strong interdependence. Okay, so this is because of trade. Okay, so we are specializing our production. Okay, other countries specialize and then they trade. But then clearly, if there are some problems, troubles in other countries, we unfortunately, okay, are subject to these negative shocks as well. This is something it's quite obvious right now. But let's forget. Okay, let's forget about. I mean, there are many other policy issues. Okay, so why strategic? Why you would like to have international trade? Okay, but let's remain. Let's not discuss political issues. Okay, but let's remain on economic issues. Okay, yeah. Still, okay, here. So here, going back to our common result is, I'm going to show you this. Okay, these are just claims, and I'm going to show you why this is the case, how this happens. Okay. So given that trade enlarges consumption possibilities as welfare, the question is clearly also, does everybody benefit from trade or not? So overall, welfare should increase, but as we're going to see is that not everybody will win from trade liberalization. There will be some losers, in particular in the short run, and there will be some losers. There will be some costs in the short run, but then in the long run, okay, you should have increases in welfare. Okay, but there for sure are some costs in the short run. Okay, I'll discuss this greater length in the following. So this is the first issue. Okay, so the first issue we are also going to discuss is, will everybody win from trade liberalization? Now, given that there are some gains from trade, and gains from trade are because of increases in consumption possibilities. Okay, so larger consumption possibilities. There are also damages. There may be damages to the environment. Okay, so the question therefore is, if there are damages to the environment, so think about those countries that specialize in the production of dirty goods. They still have, so they have therefore damage done to their environment. The question is, will gains from trade outweigh these damages? Okay, such that indeed you have increase in welfare if you take the environment into account. So therefore, these are the questions that we are going to discuss. And the consequent question is also, is there an incentive for countries to engage in ecological dumping? So ecological dumping, remember, is lowering emission standards in order to gain a competitive advantage. This is ecological dumping. Because if everybody does so, I mean, if everybody engages in ecological dumping, then what you have is just a race to the bottom. And another issue we are going to discuss is, will industries, footloose industries, there are industries that can move, I mean, their capital around, migrate to pollution havens. Okay, so pollution havens are countries where environmental standards are very low. Okay, let's go into some other discussion before going to the results. Okay, so as already mentioned, it is, many economists believe that free trade improves welfare, and this is because it enlarges consumption possibilities, increases income, and so welfare. Okay, this is the result. Okay, it enlarges consumption possibilities, it increases income, and therefore it increases welfare. And it may also be a positive thing that the industries relocate to countries with low standards. Okay, because here you see environmental resources can lead to comparative advantage. Okay, that's why, in general, you would not like to have same environmental standards for all countries, okay? Because there are differences in income per capita, and there are also differences in density, population density. There are differences in, if you think about pollution, there is a difference in terms of how the environment can absorb those pollutants. Okay, so waste sink, because remember, one of the functions of the environment is to work as a waste sink. Okay, and therefore there are clearly different potential for different environments. Okay, to do so, and therefore all these, there are many reasons for not wanting to have same environmental standards for all these countries, because countries are different. So therefore you would not want to standardize environmental taxes and so on and so forth. Okay. So you would like to do is perhaps for similar countries. And I'm going to discuss this in greater length in a minute. So changes in environmental regulation, this is what I hinted at previously. Okay. Changes in environmental regulation can lead, since a change in environmental regulation leads to a change in the endowment of environmental resources. Okay, because remember, environmental resources depend on environmental regulation. Therefore, if you change environmental policy, you change the endowment of environmental resources. And this can lead, as I'm going to discuss in a minute, to a change in comparative advantage. Okay. A simple case, okay, here in the EU, we have now a stronger environmental regulation. Okay, this can lead to some industries to move abroad. Okay, this can be a worry and it can happen. Okay, has happened. This clearly because what happens, firms here, costs of production are higher, and therefore what firms do is they relocate. Therefore, this changes the comparative advantage of country. And what therefore this may lead to, it may lead to temporary unemployment. It may lead to temporary unemployment. Because clearly, people working in heavily polluting industries can now lose their jobs because industries are shut down or just moved abroad or whatever. Okay, and therefore they lose their job. Okay, but this should be, from an economic point of view, this should be what is called frictional unemployment. Okay, so they lose their job, but if the labor market works well, okay, they should find another job. This is not always the case, clearly, because it depends on how old, how skilled these workers are, because clearly in some cases, there's no way to re-employ these individuals in other sectors. Okay? But if you see this on a longer time span, okay, since these industries are no longer in the EU, okay, younger individuals will not specialize in tasks required by these industries, and that's why you won't have unemployment, okay, in this case, because they will specialize in other things. You're stealing. International trade means that then you're going to import these goods, but in order to have trade balance, you have to export others. Okay? So meaning that you are importing something, but you're also exporting something. But clearly, these products need to be produced, and therefore you see workers have just to be relocated. It's not that you require just overall fewer individuals, it's just that they have to be relocated. Is it clear? Okay, this is at least a common viewpoint. Okay, then clearly we know that labor markets do not work perfectly, and we also know that yeah, it might take some time, okay, to adjust to such policies. And so that's why trade restrictions here made on environmental grounds should be viewed with suspicion, because they might be motivated by protectionist concerns. Yeah, there's also, I mean, also many, if you remember, policy in the US over the years, okay, participating or not in reducing CO2 emissions, okay. We know that there is a big political debate, okay, because politicians are worried about losing jobs, okay, and the short-run costs of such actions, okay. Okay, are there any questions? Because now what I would like to do is I would like to give you the theory, give you the results, and then discuss things at greater length, okay, more carefully in a detailed way. Okay, any other questions, comments? Clear? Okay, so if everything is clear, okay, what I would like to do is I would like to discuss here the Heckscher-Ohlin trade theory, which is let's say the most convenient here to use for studying environmental resources and their impact on production and the issues I've mentioned now, the questions I've raised now. So this is going to be a theory about intersectoral trade. Okay, for those of you who have seen international trade. So it's not about, remember for those who have taken international trade in undergraduate studies, intersectoral trade means that you are exporting something and importing something else, okay? Which is not the only trade we observe in reality, because in reality what we observe also what is called intersectoral trade. So you're exporting products, but you are importing the same product. Okay, so think about wine. Okay, we are exporting wine as Italy. We are, in Italy, we are exporting wine, but we are as well importing wine. Okay, this is called intersectoral trade. Okay, here I'm not going to talk about this type of trade. I'm only talking about what are the drivers of intersectoral trade, meaning that we are exporting something and importing something else. Okay, but in reality you have both. Because I'm not going to talk about intersectoral trade. Then more modern trade theory also looks at firm-specific trade. That's something I'm also not something that's particularly relevant for what I'm trying to do here. Now, what is the Heckscher-Ohlin trade theory about? The claim of Heckscher-Ohlin trade theory is that trade, so this type of trade, okay, so intersectoral trade is driven by differences in factor endowments, okay, the endowments of factors of production. Now, how does this come about? Okay, here, what is done is they characterize goods according to the intensity of factors they use. So meaning that if you have, let's make a simple example. Okay, so you have two goods, and what you want to know is which of the good is relatively intense in one type of factor of production and in the other type of factor of production. Okay, so more for the sake of concreteness, let's assume that you have just two factors of production. You have capital and labor, okay, which is the case I'm going to discuss now, and then later on I'll discuss environmental resources. But for the moment being, assume you have capital and labor, and in order to produce these two goods, you need capital and labor. Now the question is, the first question is which of the two goods is uses in a relatively intense way capital, and which of the goods uses in a relatively intense way labor. Okay, so you have labor intensive and capital intensive goods. Okay, is it clear? So meaning that you use relatively more capital or relatively more labor. Okay. Also here I will be more specific when I go into the details of the model. Okay. So, but just from an intuitive point of view, okay, if you use relatively more capital or relatively more labor, that's what matters. Because if this is clear, then the claim, and this is the theorem, and then I'm going to prove it now, not formally, I'm going to prove it. It's just some graphs, okay, some figures. The claim is the following: a country will export those goods relatively intensive in its abundant factor of production. So meaning that, for instance, if you are a country that, so you have, because the basic model is 2 countries, 2 goods, 2 factors of production. So you have 2 countries, country A and B, 2 goods, X and Y, 2 factors of production, K and A, capital and A. So very simple. Now let's assume that you have the 2 countries are US and Mexico. The US are relatively abundant of capital. Mexico is relatively abundant of labor. Okay. What you would like to make now, you would like to make a prediction about trade flows. Okay, so who exports what and who imports what. Okay, so make a prediction about trade flows. So therefore, the prediction is the following. The US is going to export the good that uses in a relatively intensive way capital, but it's capital intensive good. And it's going to import the labor intensive. Okay? And Mexico does the opposite. Okay, so let me repeat this. The US are capital abundant, and that's why the US compared with, it's a relative position, that's why compared with Mexico. Right? That's why the US are going to export the capital intensive good and import the labor intensive. Okay. Now, why is this the case? Okay, is it clear? Okay, so why is this the case? Okay, now you have to think about it in terms of autarky first, and then opening up to trade. Okay, so now if you have the 2 countries that do not trade, okay, so autarky, so no trade going on. So they're closed economies. In the US, what you will have is the following. In the US, since labor is relatively scarce, capital is abundant, you will have that the production costs are such that labor is quite expensive and capital is quite cheap. Okay, because capital is abundant, and that's why capital will be relatively cheap. And therefore, the production of goods that are capital intensive, okay, these production costs will be relatively low, and that's why the price will be relatively low. Is it clear? That's why in the US, capital intensive goods will be relatively cheap, while labor intensive goods will be relatively expensive because the US are labor scarce compared with Mexico, because in Mexico the opposite happens. In Mexico, labor is abundant, and that's why labor cost is very low, and therefore the wage rate will be low, and therefore the production costs of labor intensive goods will be low. the production costs of labor-intensive goods will be low, while the production costs of capital-intensive goods will be high. Okay, and therefore the price of the labor-intensive good will be low, while the price of the capital-intensive good will be relatively high. Okay, now if you open up to trade, you see that they can benefit from trading. That's why you see what matters here is how scarce one country is compared with the other country. So it's not absolute scarcity that matters, but it's the relative scarcity. Okay, it's not absolute scarcity that matters, but relative scarcity. Okay, this is the result, and this is the intuition. Now I'm going to build a very simple model to show you exactly this, and I explain again because understanding this is key in order to understand then what's happening later. But I guess the result is quite intuitive. And something that's not understood. It's a little bit fast, or something we already know. Okay. Okay, so let me. Okay, so here, yeah, the environmental implications before going to the model. Environmental implications, and then I'm going to the model. Okay. Here, what are the environmental implications? Well, here you see what matters are, remember, for trade, according to the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, okay, what matters for trade and for production, okay? Because here what we try to do is we try also to analyze the production structure of our economy. So what will be produced in our economy and what will not be produced, okay? What will be produced abroad, okay? And here, according to this theory, what you're going to produce at home depends on the factors of production, and in particular, the endowment of these factors of production. And from an environmental point of view, it depends on environmental regulation. Okay? Therefore, if you have low environmental standards, then you will be very rich in natural resources. Or in a similar way, if you have high assimilative capacity, you are also very rich in environmental resources. Okay? Now, countries that are rich in environmental resources, they should specialize in the production of environmentally intensive goods, because they will have a comparative advantage, like I explained before. Okay? And therefore, they should export these goods and import others. Therefore, countries that are rich in terms of environmental resources, natural resources, environmental resources, they should specialize, they have a comparative advantage in the production of these goods, and therefore they should specialize in the production of these goods, and therefore export these goods and import others.
So, just quickly ask, so when you say the export of an environmental intensive goods, are you talking about, so that's, for example, from Australia, and extract quite a lot of commodities from the ground, but we don't process it in Australia, it's processed in
both.
Asia?
Yeah, both. I mean, could be natural resources like the one you mentioned. Okay, so we have a lot of natural gas, okay, or whatever, okay, and export it. Okay, just extract it and export it, and then import others. Okay, that's what we are nowadays. Okay, so facing.
Yeah, so like I'm trying to sort of say is like it's a ration that if you have these environmental goods, then you should also process them and export that as part of this whole concept. It's not a great concept, but it's more rational to export your natural commodity, your resource, and then import and process it.
Okay. It depends whether whether it's convenient for you to do so. Okay, you would have to check whether you have a comparative advantage in doing so or not. Okay, to other countries. Okay, but here I'm really not talking about this, because what I would like now to do is I would like to here study more environmental resources in terms of pollution, okay? But also the issue you raised, okay, here is, part of this. Whether then you're going to process it or not, and depends on, again, if you have a competitive advantage in doing so or not, okay? Because it could well be the case that it pays off to do this in another country because they have, and it's cheaper to do so that way, okay? It again depends on the comparative advantage, okay? Then the country to country, and we know both. We know that both. In some cases it happens. In some. Sorry, I did not.
Like if you follow these trade rules, it's like you say it's not lot of kind of banana.
Yeah, but this is. Yeah. Now let's see what we do here. What we try to do in economics, we try to make a prediction. Okay, so it's not that because we look at the world and we try to make a prediction. Okay, to understand. We try to come up with theories to understand why certain things happen or not. Okay, it's not that they should. It's not that the world should follow strict economic laws. Okay. It's like we observe the economies and then we try to come up with theories that catch major stylized facts. Okay, so that's why it's not. I don't know if I somehow clarified this. Okay, so it's not. Okay. Yeah, but just remember, okay, so we are just here. It's not that by describing it, this is usually what I do with my micro students, okay? So when I explain consumer behavior, which is kind of strange, I don't know if you have an economic background, do you have? Okay, well, economic theory can be very strange, okay, for those that are new to economics, okay? So it's not that we explain a theory that's how consumers should behave. Okay, this is the right way to do it. No, we try to come up with a theory that captures certain stylized fact, and then whether the theory is true or not, we have to go to the data and check and test the theory. Okay, that's what we have to do. That's what we are doing here as well. Okay, we build models and then we're going to test it. Okay, so that's why here we build a model, get some results in terms of predictions, and then to see whether these predictions are true or not, we have to go to the data, okay? And that's what I do in the second part of the course, okay? And here, what's important from an environmental point of view is that since trade flows, according to this theory, depend on on endowments, okay? And therefore, on the endowment of environmental resources, in particular, here, usually, clearly, it's the case you mentioned just that is natural resources that we just extract and use and export and whatever. But what we are more interested in are like environmental resources like pollution, CO2 emissions or whatever. And in this case, environmental resources are determined by environmental regulation, because it depends on how strict these environmental regulations are. Okay, so by strengthening environmental regulation, what you have is you reduce the endowments of environmental resources, and that's why you see other countries get a comparative advantage, and accordingly you should import them. Okay, so production should go abroad. This is a prediction of the model. I'm going to now show you from a theoretical point of view why this should happen, and then I'm going to show you data if this is happening or not. Okay, this is how. And therefore, here we're just finishing this up, and then I guess I'm going to take a break. So, what are the welfare effects of trade liberalization? Here, mentioned already several times now, is you should have positive gains from trade. Okay, so meaning that just by trading, okay, what you have is you enlarge consumption possibilities. So meaning you can consume things you could not have done previously. But then you have a second effect in the case of environmental resources, and that is if you have a higher production of if you have a higher production of environmentally intensive goods, then this can negatively affect welfare. Okay, so if you are a country that specializes in the production of, for instance, dirty goods, then you have more pollution. Okay? Then you have more pollution, and this pollution negatively affects your welfare. Okay, so you see, you have on the one side a positive effect, and the other side you have a negative effect. And what we are going to see is that the overall effect will depend on economic policy. Okay, so the overall effect will depend on economic policy. So what kind of policy is in place, and I'm going to discuss this. Okay, so now I would like to take a break now for lunch. And after lunch, I'm going to show you the model, the results, and then, yeah, that will be that will be for today. And then tomorrow, no, tomorrow we don't have lectures because you have a seminar. So we'll have, yeah, tomorrow there's no lecture, okay, because I'm told, I was asked to move, okay, my lecture. That's why tomorrow we won't have lectures. We'll have lecture again on next Tuesday, where we see the empirical part. Okay, thanks for the moment being, and talk to you in half an hour, okay, after the break.